All right, it's time for another recommendation video, and I'm very excited about this one. This is where I'm going to recommend 10 works by LATINX authors because it's LATINX readathons coming up. It starts in mid-October, and it's also fall, so I have a couple fall autumnal spooky atmospheric reads to share by these authors, so it just seemed like the perfect time. And let's get into it. I have it split into categories. I have my fall recommendations, I have some fantasy books, and I have short story collections, and the timestamps will all be down below so you can hop around. I'm just very excited. I'm Venezuelan American, and I have been searching for speculative sci-fi fantasy books that I can recommend to myself primarily and others. So I'm very excited to have this list of 10 works to share with you today, and without further preamble, let's get into it. Starting with The Inheritance of Orquídea Divina, this is going to start off our fall recommendation list, and this is probably the newest release that I've read on this list. I have a review for it, so if you want more in-depth thoughts, this is a work by Zoraida Cordova. I love her works. She is an autobi author. She may show up later on this list. Spoiler alert. But this is the newest release. It's an adult fantasy standalone and is very atmospheric, very seasonal for fall. I think it will work for a lot of people. So the premise of this story is Orquídea Montoya is this amazing woman. She's had several husbands. She seems to have magical properties. Like the way she builds her home is not with conventional means. And then one day she sends letters to all of her children saying, I'm dying, come collect your inheritance. That is the start of this story. And there are family histories and mysteries that everyone's trying to uncover. And after what seems like a lull, there then seems to be kind of some stuff in the past that comes haunting the rest of the family. And you kind of unpack that. It's got cool, creepy circuses. You get to explore the past in Ecuador, and with Orquídea's life, you get to follow her family members. I loved so much of this story, and it for sure makes you feel like you are in the multiple settings that you're in, which I feel like is quintessential fall read material. I had a great time with it. I list more of my pros and cons in my standalone review, but I'll keep it short here. But I highly recommend it. It's a new release. It just came out, and the cover is stunning. And I don't own the Book of the Month version, but I bought the version at the bookstore and can confirm it's a quality book to hold in your hands. It's just like great. And it's perfect for a weekend read with a blanket because it's only 300 some pages. So if you like really have a weekend where you just want to like read and bake and alternate between those things, couldn't ask for a better book to pick up. The next one I'll talk about is one I haven't mentioned in quite a bit, and that's Dark and Deep is Red by Anna Marie McLemore. I love this book. I did not read this in fall, but I firmly believe it's a good fall read. Again, because of its atmospheric feels and vibes. It's also kind of sort of a light fairy tale retelling, and I know a lot of people associate fairy tale retellings with this time of year. And this is more a story based off a dancing plague that took place, I can't remember if it's France or Spain. And you have, again, two timelines in this story. You have a timeline during that plague where you're following a Romani family who are attempting to pass as Italian so they don't become the scapegoat for this plague that's happening, but also just to exist without having to defend their culture all the time. And then we have more present day. We have our main character who's Mexican American, whose family makes shoes and lives in this very mystical, magical town where every year something magical happens that people just accept. And this year it has to do with these red shoes. But she doesn't get a pair, so she kind of makes her own, and there are unforeseen consequences. And you kind of follow these two stories in parallel and how they intersect and how they relate to each other. And I was completely captivated by the lush prose of this work. It very much reminded me of works like Uprooted or Spinning Silver or Bear and the Nightingale. Like that's what I was being reminded of as I read this story. Although it doesn't have a cold setting like The Bear and the Nightingale or Spinning Silver. And it doesn't quite have like the creepy forest of Uprooted. But in terms of just like the atmosphere and the lush prose and how I was just swept away by this tale, it had all of those things, and I really loved it. I loved a lot what it had to say about acceptance and culture and being the minority and being the other. So I really recommend that one for fall, and in general, I still need to read more of their works, and they're on my list. It's going to happen because there's so many, because I have a feeling that they could be a favorite author of mine. Next, we're going to talk about some more traditional picks, the first one being Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This is a Gothic horror story. So it seems pretty great for fall, especially if you want something creepy that's not too scary. I would say it's unsettling in ways when horror becomes commentary on life. like, think of movies like Get Out or something like that, where it's definitely kind of has you at the edge of your seat, but it's less about, like, jump scares or imagery, although there is some creepy imagery in this, and more about, like, what's actually happening and what people are actually saying and what they believe, and you're just like, woo. And it has a lot of the hallmarks from Gothic horror, from what I've been told. I actually, I've read this book, but I haven't read many Gothic horror stories. But it had a creepy house. It had a very spunky character. It reminded me, personally, so I've watched a lot of Alfred Hitchcock, which definitely has more thriller horror vibes in that genre. And it felt like an Alfred Hitchcock. And it takes place in the 50s, so I really enjoyed that, because one of my favorite pastimes when I was growing up was just watching Alfred Hitchcock with my grandmother and watching these, like, creepy films. Or it reminded me of, this one I don't think was Alfred Hitchcock, but it had Angela Lansbury, I think, and it was Gaslight. It reminded me of films like that. So if you like those films, you probably should pick this book up. And similar to actually both of the previous books, it's another 300-page book that you can easily read in a weekend when you just want to snuggle with a blanket and, like, feel a sense of accomplishment while, you know, drinking your tea or your coffee or whatever. And the last one I'll have for the fall recommendations category is Cemetery Boys by Aidan Thomas. I mean, I feel like I don't have to explain why I have this on this list. It's about Yadriel, who wants to prove that he's a brujo. That's a witch, if you didn't know. And they're trans. So although their family accepts them, you know, calls them by their new name and says, you know, they say he, him, and they're generally accepting of Yadriel as trans, they don't believe that the magic will accept him as trans. Because in this world, you have brujos and brujas, and they have different magical abilities. Brujos deal with spirits, and brujas deal with healing. And they won't let him go through his rite of passage. And he's like, nah, I'm going to do it. And accidentally summons the wrong ghost. And shenanigans ensued from there. It is a very warm story. Like, you have all of the mysteries that you kind of associate with this time of year, because mainly they're summoning a ghost because he's trying to solve a mystery and now he has the wrong ghost. But also the relationship between Julian and Yadriel, chef's kiss. I still think of one scene like consistently. So definitely recommend this one, especially at the end of October, early November, because it takes place during Dia de los Muertos, so Day of the Dead. So, like, if you really want to be seasonally in line, that's when I read it last year, and I have zero regrets. The next section I want to talk about are the short story collections, because one of the short story collections I would put into fall recommendations, so I wanted to bring it up while I'm still talking about that, and that's Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado. I am rereading this right now, and I could not be more pleased with my life decisions. I'm reading it for a book club that will be happening early October on Rachel's channel at Reads with Rachel, and it is a speculative short story collection with very creepy takes on discussions of feminism and rights and relationships to one's body in the world or yourself, different things about intimacy and relationships. I love all of the themes in this short story collection. The first story is very like urban folk tales, which is very, I feel, fall, you know, when you're talking around a campfire telling stories. It has a lot of that tension. Like, it feels like you're telling a story where you have the lights flickering, or you have the rain rattling the windows and things like that. You have contagion stories. You have stories about bodies vanishing. Like, it's full of unsettling things. Like, there's definitely several stories where you have unreliable narrators and you do not know what is happening pretty consistently, and I love it so much. And the next collection I want to talk about that I think you can read probably any time of year is a sci-fi collection by Carlos Hernandez called The Assimilated Cuban's Guide to Quantum Santeria. It is such a mouthful. So this is a sci-fi collection that I really loved because it seamlessly incorporates Puerto Ricans and Cubans and other people in the Latinx community into just sci-fi stories that are solid and good, and they're actually not all gloom and doom. I feel like sci-fi stories can be very depressing at times, to say the least, and I like those. I do like a good depressing story. I mean, like, one of the most classic sci-fi stories is Foundation, right? And that's literally about an empire falling apart. It's on my mind because I was just watching the episodes for the new show that came out. But in these stories, you're really just going to have really cool ideas and takes on things. And I always say this when I bring up this collection, but there is a story called The Fantasy Impromptu, which is a piece by Chopin. And I played piano for several years of my life, and I played that piece as a third grader. And the way that song is described in that short story, I just, like, instantly connected to. I'm like, yes, this is how this song goes. And it was about, like, the soul of this man in a piano It was amazing. There were many moments where I was just like, oh yeah, I'm bringing all the suitcases to see your family so then they could take the suitcases back home because you're the one helping supply them with lots of things that are easy to get in the United States that aren't as easy to get in their countries. Very relatable. So there were just lots of little touches that really made these stories come to life for me in very relatable ways that I don't usually get to experience in science fiction stories. I don't think any of them in particular, besides the piano one, which I have a very personal connection to, stand out for me, but I just love that it exists, and I was so happy when I read it. Like, I was just full of joy reading these sci-fi stories because it just seamlessly included parts of my life and culture into the pages, and I just never get to see that. So if you want to have not, like, very accessible sci-fi stories that are not doom and gloom, that are just happily inclusive, I would check it out. And now we'll get into my fantasy picks, starting with Gods of Jade and Shadow by Sylvia Moreno Garcia. This is actually the first work I read by her, and I don't like it as much as Mexican Gothic, but I still think it's a really fun time, especially if you want a different setting and time period to consume your fantasy, and once again, a short work. This takes place, I believe, the Jazz Age, so kind of 1920s Mexico, and you're traveling across Mexico to accomplish a task because our main character accidentally awakens the god of the dead, and if she doesn't help him accomplish a task, her life is kind of forfeit. And along the way, you get to meet different people who are important to different parts of, I believe, Mayan mythology. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure this is Mayan mythology and not Aztec, and if I'm wrong, I'm sorry, and I'll correct it on the screen. But you get to watch them go on this journey and interact with people, and it's kind of your classic quest story, which is why, like, it's not one of my favorite things, because that formula of a story doesn't work for me. But besides the formula, I really loved Cassiopeia, our main character. I loved watching the relationship evolve between this god of death and Cassiopeia, and I really just liked her as a character and exploring this world. It was so vibrant and colorful and full of mythology that I don't normally get to interact with in a fantasy book. So all of those things really make it worth recommending in my book, even if it's not my typical type of narrative trope and formulaic structure, if that makes sense. The next one that I need to recommend is Each of Us a Desert by Mark Oshiru. I love this book. I love this book so much. I own this book. I have it right here. I bought it. I didn't even read a physical version. I bought it, okay? So, put the image back up. This story is so good. It's dystopian fantasy. I never get to read dystopian fantasy. Dystopians are usually either like dystopian or dystopian sci-fi or some combination of the two. I know some people say Hunger Games is kind of fantasy. For me, it has a lot of technology and not a lot of mythical things going on. But Each of Us a Desert is dystopian fantasy, and it has such cool world building, and it's such a great coming of age story of Xochi, who is the keeper of all of the stories. So when people need to get something off their chest, when they have basically done wrong, they come to her and tell her their story, and then she has to give it back to the land, to Solis, the god. And this is a thing she's been doing forever, and she is so young, like she's 13 or 14, and she's just like, I'm exhausted, I'm done. And then she goes on this journey across this desert, and you kind of learn about the things that she was taught, how much of it is true, what's not true. She gets to analyze who she is and what she believes and where she's going to end up. You meet more people. I really love the story. I love the narrative structure of it. I cannot wait to reread it. And also just the world building is so dark. It's so cool. I was both intrigued by Xochi's journey, but also by myself just learning about this world. I'm very world building driven when I read fantasy, and usually when I read young adult, I'm not that intrigued by the world building. I'm usually intrigued by other factors, usually the characters, or maybe it's a trope that I'm very comfortable in. But this was a young adult fantasy that just I was on the edge of my seat wanting to know more about this world all the time because it was a place I'd never been before, and I really enjoyed it. I loved learning about it. I thought it was masterfully done, and if I can get another person to pick this up, I will be so happy because I do believe it is still so severely underrated because it's not a traditional young adult, so it's hard to find the buzzwords to get the right people to pick it up because this is not a fast-paced story. It's a traveling story. It's very introspective. It's very lush. And that's hard to find the right audience for because I know a lot of adult fantasy readers won't pick this up, or I have some friends who think this might be too magical realism for them. It's just really hard because it's honestly its own thing. and it's so good. And I just want more people to pick it up. And the last one we'll talk about, it's actually two, but it's a duology, so we'll talk about it as one, and that's the Hollow Ground duology by Zoraida Cordova. I did say she would come on this list again. So where I was saying Each of Us a Desert is very much like its own like take in young adult. Like, it's young adult in that it's a coming of age story, and that's where it's published, etc. This is a young adult story in that it has some tropes, and it is great in executing those tropes. We've got the girl who's kind of not like any other girl, you know, sort of thing. Not really, but Ren has this power. So there are different powers you can have. And so she has a pretty unique power where she can take people's memories. There's also a twist that in this world, if you have powers, the current evil king will persecute you. It's basically based off the Spanish Inquisition. So at first she used to be kind of, as a kid, she was stolen and meant to work for the king and then was rescued, and now she works with the rebels, but the rebels never completely trust her. So that's Ren. We're dealing with her. She is not a unique person you meet in young adult fantasy. And she was fine though, because I could not put this book down. Ever. The first book, my heart was racing for like 100 pages. I was so stressed. I didn't know what was going to happen. And the first book is a 4-star read for me. It doesn't do anything groundbreaking, but I had a fun time. I had fun theorizing about who was important for what part of the plot. And then it sets up my favorite trope for the second book. And I gave the second book 5 stars because the second book delivered on exactly what I wanted. And I can't really go into it without spoiling the first book. And if you want to know, I will gladly tell you. I just don't want to spoil anyone who's watching the video. But it's a duology. Each book's about 300 pages. I think what this book does that's so important when you want to read a comfortable, tropey part of young adult fiction, when maybe that's, you know, a thing you've read so many times before. And keep in mind, I don't read that much young adult fantasy, so maybe I don't get as burnt out as other people because I only pick it up when I'm really in the mood. But it being so short, I never felt like it was just having word filler. Because sometimes when I read any book, honestly, if it can overstay its welcome, and these never overstayed their welcome for me. They were exactly the length that I thought the stories should be. And I had a great time. It was great found family. There was great, like, save the day energy. It was good. So if you do want kind of a tropey YA experience that has my seal of approval, the Hollow Crown duology. So those are the 10 works I wanted to talk about. Let me know any recommendations you have. I do have one that I know is by an Argentinian author that I need to read. I think Tender is the Flesh. So that's one that's on my radar. But in general, I am always looking for Latinx authors in speculative spaces, like always. So feel free to put them down below and I will check them out. I will put them on my TBR because I would love to always be recommending 5 to 10 new books this time every year because it is something I am extremely passionate about. And if you've made it this far and don't want to leave anything in the comments but just want me to know you're here, I don't know, leave an emoji. What did we talk about? Ooh, leave a ghost for Cemetery Boys. That'll be cool. And like if you liked it, subscribe if you want to, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.